I'm Brittany. This is Merlin, and welcome to Gaywatch, where we watch and read gay things. So, we get to start Prince's Gambit today. Book 2 of the Captive Prince trilogy. Aside from being just deeply excited to get farther into Captive Prince, just a couple things. We read for 2 hours. We take a little break around halfway through. Please no spoilers in the chat, because there are plenty of people here who are first-time readers. I am not a first-time reader. I have read this before. However, it has been a second, but, I still remember most things. But the point is that we have newbies in the chat, so please no spoilers. There are trigger warnings, however, down in the description in case you need them. This is a world that deals with sexual slavery and slavery in general, but there's a focus on the sexual slavery aspect. So if you need, a heads up about things, then I would go ahead and probably check the trigger warnings. So, was there anything you may have noticed yesterday that Gaywatch was gone for a little bit? It was gone for about 8 to 10 hours. That's because I made a very silly mistake, and in trying to get some slow damage videos ready to go where they need to go, I upload an uncensored video for slow damage that really should have been censored. And so I got automatically slapped down by, their bots that keep track of that kind of thing. And I just had to appeal it to get it put back up. So, in case you were wondering why we went dark there for a little bit yesterday, that was entirely my fault. And I won't be making that mistake again. Definitely not. No thanks. Woo. And I believe, oh yes, Rumi, first of all, Janae Henning's here. We love Janae Henning. Go subscribe to her. She runs a great channel. If you're into East Asian media, go check out Janae. And then Rumi said something about upping the volume, so I'm going to up the volume again really quickly on the microphone. I could not do this before the stream because you guys were in the break room, and I did not have the control right with me, and I would have had to take you guys out of the break room in order to do that. I actually think it may have reverted, because I remember upping the volume a little while ago, and it may have actually gone back to its old setting. So I've turned up the volume a little bit. Hopefully that makes a difference. I don't want to go too high too much and all that jazz. So now that we have gotten everything out of the way, let us begin. Princess Gambit! I'm very excited. Deeply excited. Okay, it's fine. I'm fine. It's fine. It's totally fine. I'm very normal about it. The shadows were long with sunset when they rode up, and the horizon was red. Chastillon was a single jutting tower, a dark round bulk. Castles far to the south, Ravenel and Fortaine built to withstand battering siege. Damon gazed at the view, unsettled. He found it impossible to look at the approach without seeing the castle at Marlis, that distant tower flanked by long red fields. "It's hunting country," said Orlan, mistaking the nature of his gaze. "Dare you to make a run for it?" He said nothing. He was not here to run. It was a strange feeling to be unchained and riding with a group of Varetian soldiers of his own free will. A day's ride, even at the slow pace of wagons through pleasant countryside in late spring, was enough by which to judge the quality of a company. Gavar did very little but sit, an impersonal shape above the swishing tail of his muscled horse, but whoever had captained these men previously had drilled them to maintain immaculate formation over the long course of a ride. The discipline was a little surprising. Damon wondered if they could hold their lines in a fight. If they could, there was some cause for hope, though in truth his wellspring of good mood had more to do with the outdoors, the sunshine, and the illusion of freedom that came with being given a horse and a sword. Even the weight of the gold collar and cuffs on his throat and wrists could not diminish it. The household servants had turned out to meet them, arraying themselves as they would for the arrival of any significant party. The regent's men, who were supposedly stationed at Chastillon awaiting the prince's arrival, were nowhere to be seen. There were 50 horses to be stabled, 50 sets of armor and tack to be unstrapped, and 50 places to be readied in the barracks. And that was only the men-at-arms, not the servants and wagons. But in the enormous courtyard, the prince's party looked small, insignificant. Chastillon was large enough to swallow 50 men, as though the number was nothing. No one was pitching tents. The men would sleep in the barracks. Laurent would sleep in the keep. Laurent swung out of the saddle, peeled off his riding gloves, tucking them into his belt, and gave his attention to the castellan. Gavard barked a few orders, and Damon found himself occupied with armor, detailing and care of his horse. Across the courtyard, a couple of allons hounds came bounding down the stone stairs to throw themselves ecstatically at Laurent, who indulged one of them with a rub behind the ears, causing a spasm of jealousy in the other. Orlan broke Damon's attention. "Physician wants you," he said, pointing with his chin to an awning at the far end of the courtyard, under which could be glimpsed a familiar gray head. Damon put down the breastplate he was holding and went. "Sit," said the physician. Damon did so, rather gingerly, on the only available seat, a small three-legged stool. The physician began to unbuckle a worked leather satchel. "Show me your back." "It's fine." "After a day in the saddle, in armor," said the physician. "It's fine," said Damon. The physician said, "Take off your shirt." The physician's gaze was implacable. After a long moment, Damon reached behind himself and drew his shirt off, exposing the breadth of his shoulders to the physician. It was fine. His back had healed enough that new scars had replaced new wounds. Damon craned for a glimpse, but, not being an owl, saw almost nothing. He stopped before he got a crick in his neck. The physician rummaged in the satchel and produced one of his endless ointments. "A massage?" "These are healing salves. It should be done every night. It will help the scarring to fade a little in time." That was really too much. "It's cosmetic?" The physician said, "I was told you would be difficult." "Very well. The better it heals, the less your back will trouble you with stiffness, both now and later in life, so that you will be better able to swing a sword around, killing a great many people. I was told you would be responsive to that argument." We love him. We love and stan this freaking physician Yes. This is an appropriate physician character. Thank you. "The prince," said Damon. "But of course, all this tender care of his back, like soothing with a kiss the reddened cheek you have slapped." But he was, infuriatingly, right. Damon needed to be able to fight. The ointment was cool and scented, and it worked on the effect of a long day's ride. One by one, Damon's muscles unlocked. His neck bent forward, his hair falling a little about his face. His breathing eased. The physician worked with impersonal hands. "I don't know your name," Damon admitted. "You don't remember my name. You were in and out of consciousness the night we met. A lash or two more, you might not have seen the morning." Damon snorted. It wasn't that bad. The physician gave him an odd look. "My name is Pascal," was all he said. "Pascal," said Damon. "It's your first time to ride with troops on campaign?" The name, Pascal, I might be getting that wrong. Because I looked at the pronunciation guide, but it hasn't entirely stuck yet. So I could be correct and just not know it. Or I could just be totally wrong and it needs to actually settle into my brain. "No, I was the king's physician. I tended the fallen at Marlos and at Saint-Pellier." There was a silence. Damon had meant to ask Pascal what he knew of the regent's men, but now he said nothing, just held his bunched shirt in his hands. The work on his back continued, slow and methodical. "I fought at Marlos," said Damon. "I assumed you had." Another silence. Damon had a view of the ground under the awning, packed earth instead of stone. He looked down at a scuff mark, the torn edge of a dry leaf. The hands on his back eventually lifted and were done. Outside, the courtyard was clearing. Laurent's men were efficient. Damon stood, shook out his shirt. "If you served the king," said Damon, "how is it you now find yourself in the prince's household and not his uncle's?" "Men find themselves in the places they put themselves," Pascal said, closing his satchel with a snap. We might stand Pascal, presuming I'm saying his name correctly. Whew! Exactly. Write that down. Men find themselves in the places they put themselves. This man. I'm correct. Oh, thank you, M. Pascal, I'm correct. Oh, I'm so happy I actually got that right. It's what he deserves. Whoa, hey, hang on. Did I just talk myself right onto another page? I think I did. Hang on. No, there we go. Returning to the courtyard, he couldn't report to Gaywatch, who had vanished, but he did find Jord, directing traffic. "Can you read and write?" Jord asked him. "Yes, of course," said Damon, then stopped. Jord didn't notice. "Almost nothing's been done to prepare for tomorrow. The prince says we're not leaving without a full arsenal. He also says we're not delaying departure. Go to the western armory, take an inventory, and give it to that man," pointing, Rocher. Since taking a full inventory was a task that would take all night, Damon assumed what he was to do was check the existing inventory, which he found in a series of leather-bound books. He opened the first of them, searching for the correct pages, and felt a strange sensation pass over him when he realized that he was looking at a 7-year-old list of hunting weaponry made for the Crown Prince Auguste. Prepared for His Highness the Crown Prince Auguste. Garniture of hunter's cutlery, 1 staff, 8-tipped spearheads, bow, and strings. He was not alone in the armory. From somewhere behind shelves, he heard the cultured voice of a young male courtier saying, "You've heard your orders. They come from the prince." "Why should I believe that? You his pet?" said a coarser voice. And another, "I'd pay to watch that." And another, "The prince has got ice in his veins. He doesn't fuck. We'll take orders when the captain comes and tells us them himself." "How dare you speak about your prince like that? Choose your weapon." "I said choose your weapon. Now." "You're going to get hurt, pup." "If you're too much of a coward to," said the courtier, and before he was even halfway through that sentence, Damon was folding his grip around one of the swords and walking out. He rounded the corner just in time to see one of 3 men in the regent's livery draw back, swing, and punch the courtier hard in the face. The courtier wasn't a courtier. It was the young soldier whose name Laurent had dryly mentioned to Jord. Tell the servants to sleep with their legs closed. And Aymeric. It might be Aymeric. M, since you're here, can you remind me, please? I believe it's Aymeric, now that I say it. Aymeric staggered backwards. Aymeric! Thank you, M. Aymeric staggered backwards and hit the wall, sliding halfway down its length as he opened and closed his eyes with stupefied blinks. Blood poured from his nose. The 3 men had seen Damon. "That's shut him up," said Damon equitably. "Why don't you leave it at that, and I'll take him back to the barracks?" It wasn't Damon's size that stopped them. It wasn't the sword he held casually in his hand. If these men really wanted to make a fight out of it, there were enough swords, flingable armor pieces, and teetering shelves to turn this into something long and ludicrous. It was only when the leader of the men saw Damon's gold collar that he shoved down an arm, holding the others back. And Damon understood, in that moment, exactly how things were going to be on this campaign. The regent's men in ascendancy. Aymeric and the prince's men were targets because they had no one to complain to except Gaywatch, who would slap them back down. Gaywatch, the regent's favorite thug, brought here to keep the prince's men in check. But Damon was different. Damon was untouchable, because Damon had a direct line of reportage to the prince. He waited. The men, unwilling to openly defy the prince, decided on discretion. The man who had laid out Aymeric nodded slowly, and the 3 moved off and out, Damon watching them go. He turned to Aymeric. noting his fine skin and elegant wrists. It wasn't unheard of for younger sons of the highborn to seek out a position in the royal guard, making what name for themselves they could. But as far as Damon had seen, Laurent's men were of a rougher sort. Aymeric was probably exactly as out of place among them as he looked. Damon held out his hand, which Aymeric ignored, pushing himself up. "How old are you, 18? 19, said Aymeric. Around the smashed nose, he had a fine-boned, aristocratic face, beautifully shaped dark brows, long dark lashes. He was more attractive up close. You noticed things like his pretty mouth, even dripping with nosebleed. Damon said, "It's never a good idea to start a fight, particularly against 3 men when you're the type who goes down with 1 punch. If I go down, I stand back up. I'm not afraid to be hit," said Aymeric. "Well, good, because if you insist on provoking the regent's men, it's going to happen a lot. Tip your head back." Aymeric stared at him, hand clasped to his nose, holding a fistful of blood. "You're the prince's pet. I've heard all about you." Damon said, "If you're not going to tip your head back, why don't we go find Pascal? He can give you a scented ointment." Aymeric didn't budge. "You couldn't take a flogging like a man. You opened your mouth and squealed to the regent. You laid hands on him. You spat on his reputation. Then you tried to escape, and he still intervened for you because he'd never abandoned a member of his household to the regency. Not even someone like you." Damon had gone very still. He looked at the boy's young, bloody face and reminded himself that Aymeric had been willing to take a beating from 3 men in defense of his prince's honor. He'd call it misguided puppy love, except that he'd seen the glint of something similar in Jord and Orlan, and even, in his own quiet way, in Pascal. Damon thought of the ivory and gold casing that held a creature duplicitous, self-serving, and untrustworthy. "You're so loyal to him. Why is that?" "I'm not a turncoat Achiellan dog," said Aymeric. Scene break. Damon delivered the inventory to Rocher, and the prince's guard began the task of preparing arms, armor, and wagons for their departure of the following morning. It was work that should have been done before their arrival by the regent's men, but of the 150 regent's men set to ride out with the prince, fewer than 24 had turned out to help them. Those aren't great numbers. Did you catch that? The prince has 50, the regent has 150. That's bad. That's really bad. Didn't they say at the end of, book 1, didn't they say it's like, don't expect much more of the regent's men than like what we have, to mean that we're not going to have a ton of people along, so we're vulnerable in that way? But now it's like, we outnumber Prince's guys 3-1. That's not ideal. Damon joined the work, where he was the only man to smell, expensively, of ointments and cinnamon. The sole knot remaining in Damon's back concerned the fact that the castellan had ordered him to report to the keep when he was done. After an hour or so, Jord approached him. "Aymeric's young. He says it won't happen again," said Jord. "It will happen again, and once the 2 factions in this camp start retaliating against one another, your campaign is over," he didn't say. He said, "Where's the captain?" "The captain is in one of the horse stalls up to his waist in the stable, boy," said Jord. Jesus Christ. Vivid, Jord, thank you. "The prince has been waiting for him at the barracks. Actually, I was told to have you fetch him." "From the stables," said Damon. He stared at Jord in disbelief. "Better you than me," said Jord. "Look for him down the back. Oh, and when you're done, report to the keep." It was a long walk across 2 courtyards from the barracks to the stables. Damon hoped that Govar would be finished by the time he arrived, but of course, he wasn't. The stables contained all the quiet sounds of horses at night, but even so, Damon heard it before he saw it. The soft, rhythmic sounds coming, as Jord had accurately predicted, from the back. Damon weighed Govar's reaction to an interruption against Laurent's to being kept waiting. He pushed open the stall door. Inside, Govar was unambiguously fucking the stable boy against the far wall. The boy's pants were in a crumpled heap on the straw not far from Damon's feet. His bare legs were splayed wide and his shirt was open and pushed up onto his back. His face was pressed to the rough wooden paneling and held in place by Govar's fist and his hair. Govar was dressed. He had unlaced his own pants only enough to take out his cock. Govar stopped long enough to glance sideways and say, "What?" before, deliberately, continuing. The stable boy, seeing Damon, reacted differently, squirming. "Stop," said the stable boy. "Stop, not with someone watching. Calm down, it's just the prince's pet." Govar jerked the stable boy's head back for emphasis. Damon said, "The prince wants you." "He can wait," said Govar. "No, he can't." "He wants me to pull out on his order. Go visit him with a hard prick." Govar bared his teeth in a grin. "You think that too stuck up to fuck stuff is just an act and he's really just a tease who wants cock?" Damon felt anger settle inside him, a tangible weight. He recognized an echo of the impotence Aymeric must have experienced in the armory, except that he was not a green 19-year-old who had never seen a fight. His eyes passed impassively over the half-unclothed body of the stable boy. He realized that in a moment he was going to return to Govar in this small, dusty stall all that was owed for the rape of Erasmus. He said, "Your prince gave you an order." Govar forestalled him, pushing the stable boy away in annoyance. "Fuck, I can't get off with all this," tucking himself back in. The stable boy stumbled a few steps, sucking in air. "The barracks," said Damon, and weathered the impact of Govar's shoulder against his own as Govar strode out. The stable boy stared at Damon, breathing hard. He was braced against the wall with one hand, the other was between his legs in furious modesty. Wordlessly, Damon picked up the boy's pants and tossed them at him. "He was supposed to pay me a copper soul," said the stable boy sullenly. Damon said, "I'll take it up with the prince." Another scene break. And then it was time to report to the Castellan, who led him up steps and all the way into the bedchamber. It was not as ornate as the palace chambers in Arles. The walls were thick hewn stone. The windows were frosted glass, crisscrossed with lattice. With the darkness outside, they did not offer a view, but instead reflected the shadows of the room. A frieze of twining vine leaves ran around the room. There was a carved mantel and a banked fire, and lamps and wall hangings, and the cushions and silks of a separate slave pallet, he noticed, with a feeling of relief. Dominating the room was the heavy opulence of the bed. The walls around the bed were paneled in dark carved wood, depicting a hunting scene in which a boar was held at the end of a spear, pierced through the neck. There was no sign of the blue and gold starburst. The draperies were blood red. Damon said, "These are the regent's chambers." There was something uneasily transgressive about the idea of sleeping in the place meant for Laurent's uncle. "The prince stays here often?" The Castellan mistook him to mean the keep, not the rooms. "Not often. He and his uncle came here a great deal together in the year or two after Marlis. As he grew older, the prince lost his taste for the runs here. He now comes only rarely to Chastillon." Oh. Welcome to Book 2, everybody. At the order of the Castellan. Servants brought him bread and meat, and he ate. They cleared away the plates and brought in a beautifully shaped pitcher and goblets, and left, perhaps by accident, the knife. Damon looked at the knife and thought about how much he would have given for an oversight like that when he was trussed up in Arles, a knife that he might take and use to prize his way out of the palace. He sat himself down to wait. On the table before him was a detailed map of Ver and Achielos, each hill and crest, each town and keep meticulously recorded. The river Serein snaked its way south, but he already knew they were not following the river. He put his fingertip on Chastillon and traced one possible path to Delpha, south through Ver until he reached the line that marked the edge of his own country, all the place names written jarringly in Veretian. Achelos. Ooh, I wonder if that's Achelos. Delfer. In Arl, the regent had sent assassins to kill his nephew. It had been death at the bottom of a poisoned cup at the end of a drawn sword. That was not what was happening here. Throw together two feuding companies, put them under a partisan, intolerant captain, and hand the result to a green commander prince. This group was going to tear itself apart. And likely there was nothing Damon could do to stop it happening. This was going to be a ride of disintegrating morale. The ambush that surely awaited them at the border would devastate a company already in disarray, ruined by infighting and negligent leadership. Laurent was the only counterweight against the regent, and Damon would do all he had promised to keep him alive, but the stark truth of this ride to the border was that it felt like the last play in a game that was already over. Whatever business Laurent had with Gauvard kept him deep into the night. The sounds from the keep grew quiet. The fluttering of the flames grew audible on the hearth. Damon sat and waited, his hands loosely clasped. The feelings that freedom, the illusion of freedom, stirred in him were strange. He thought of Jord and Aymeric and all Laurent's men working through the night to prepare for an early departure. There were house servants in the keep, and he was not eager for Laurent's return. But as he waited in the empty rooms, the fire flickering in the hearth, his eyes passing over the careful lines of the map, he was conscious, as he had seldom been during his captivity, of being alone. Laurent entered, and Damon rose from his seat. Orlan could be glimpsed in the doorway behind him. "You can go, I don't need a guard on the door," said Laurent. Orlan nodded. The door closed. Laurent said, "I have saved you till last." Damon said, "You owe the stable boy a copper soul." "The stable boy should learn to demand payment before he bends over." Laurent calmly helped himself to goblet and pitcher, pouring himself a drink. Damon couldn't help glancing at the goblet, remembering the last time they had been alone together in Laurent's rooms. Pale brows arched a fraction. "Your virtue's safe, it's just water." "Probably." Laurent took a sip, then lowered the goblet, holding it in refined fingers. He glanced at the chair, as a host might, offering a seat, and said, as though the words amused him, "Make yourself comfortable. You're going to stay the night." "No restraints?" said Damon. "You don't think I'll try to leave, pausing only to kill you on the way out?" "Not until we get closer to the border," said Laurent. Oh. He returned Damon's gaze evenly. There was no sound but the crack and pop of the banked fire. "You really do have ice in your veins, don't you?" said Damon. Laurent placed the goblet carefully back on the table and picked up the knife. It was a sharp knife, made for cutting meat. Damon felt his pulse quicken as Laurent came forward. Only a handful of nights ago he had watched Laurent slit a man's throat, spilling blood as red as the silk that covered this room's bed. He felt shock as Laurent's fingers touched his, pressing the hilt of the knife into his hand. Laurent took hold of Damon's wrist below the gold cuff, firmed his grip, and drew the knife forward so that it was angled towards his own stomach. The tip of the blade pressed slightly into the dark blue of his prince's garment. "You heard me tell Orlan to leave," said Laurent. Damon felt Laurent's grip slide down his wrist to his fingers and tighten. Laurent said, "I am not going to waste time on posturing and threats. Why don't we clear up any uncertainty about your intentions?" It was well placed, just below the ribcage. All you would have to do was push in, then angle up. He was so infuriatingly sure of himself, proving a point. Damon felt desire come hard upon him, not wholly a desire for violence, but a desire to drive the knife into Laurent's composure, to force him to show something other than cool indifference. He said, "I'm sure there are house servants still awake. How do I know you won't scream?" "Do I seem like the type to scream?" "I'm not going to use the knife," said Damon. "But if you're willing to put it in my hand, you underestimate how much I want to." "No," said Laurent. "I know exactly what it is to want to kill a man, and to wait." Damon stepped back and lowered the knife. His knuckles remained tight around it. They gazed at one another. Laurent said, "When this campaign is over, I think, if you are a man and not a worm, you will attempt to gain retribution for what has happened to you. I expect it. On that day, we roll the dice and see how they fall. Until then, you serve me. Let me therefore make one thing above all clear to you. I expect your obedience. You are under my command. If you object to what you are told to do, I will hear reasoned arguments in private. But if you disobey an order once it is made, I will send you back to the flogging post. Have I disobeyed an order? Said Damon. Laurent gave him another of those long, oddly searching looks. No, said Laurent. You have dragged Gauvard out of the stables to do his duty, and rescued Aymeric from a fight. Damon said, You have every other man working until dawn to prepare for tomorrow's departure. What am I doing here? Another pause, and then Laurent indicated once again to the chair. This time, Damon followed his prompt and sat. Laurent took the chair opposite. Between them, unfurled on the table, was all the intricate detail of the map. You said you knew the territory, Laurent said. That's the end of chapter 1. We are on page 19 for chapter 2. Whew. Damn. Long before they rode out the next morning, it was obvious that the regent had chosen the worst standard of men he could find to send out with his nephew. Also obvious was the fact that they had been stationed at Chastillon to conceal their poor quality from the court. They were not even trained soldiers. They were mercenaries, second- and third-rate fighters, most of them. With a rabble like this, Laurent's pretty face wasn't doing him any favors. Damon must have heard a dozen slurs and sly insinuations before he'd even saddled his horse. No wonder Aymeric had been furious. Even Damon, who had frankly no objection to man slandering Laurent, was finding himself annoyed. It was disrespectful to speak that way of any commander. He'd loosen up for the right cock, he heard. He pulled too sharply on the girth strap of his horse. He was out of sorts, perhaps. Last night had been strange, sitting across a map from Laurent, answering questions. The fire had burned low in the hearth, warm-embered. You said you knew the territory, Laurent had said, and Damon had found himself confronted with an evening spent dispensing tactical information to an enemy he might expect to face one day, country against country, king against king. And that was the best possible outcome. It assumed that Laurent would beat his uncle, and that Damon would return to Achelous, claiming his throne. You have some objection? Laurent had said. Damon had drawn in a deep breath. A strong Laurent meant a weakened regent, and if Vere was distracted by a familial squabble over the succession, that only benefited Achelous. Let Laurent and his uncle duke it out. Slowly, carefully, he had started talking. They had talked about the terrain on the border and about the route they would travel to get there. They would not be riding in a straight line south. Instead, it was to be a 2-week journey southwest through the Vauretian provinces of Varennes and Allier, their route hugging the Vascian mountain border. It was a change from the direct route that had been planned by the regent, and Laurent had already sent out riders to inform the keeps. Laurent, Damon thought, was buying himself time, extending the journey as much as possible. They had talked about the merits of Ravenel's defenses when compared to Fortaine. Laurent hadn't seemed to show any inclination to sleep. He had never once glanced at the bed. As the night wore on, Laurent had abandoned his deliberate comportment for a relaxed, youthful pose, drawing one knee up to his chest and slinging an arm around it. Damon had found his gaze drawn to the easy arrangement of Laurent's limbs, the balance of wrist on knee, the long, finely articulated bones. He had been aware of a diffuse but growing tension, a sensation almost like he was waiting for something, unsure what it was. It was like being alone in a pit with a snake. The snake could relax. You could not. About an hour before dawn, Laurent had risen. We're done for tonight, he had said briefly. And then, to Damon's surprise, he had left to begin preparations for the morning. Damon had been brusquely informed that he would be summoned when he was needed. The Castellan had called for him some hours later. Damon had taken the chance to snatch some sleep, determinedly retiring to his pallet and closing his eyes. The next time he had seen Laurent had been in the courtyard, changed and armored and coolly ready to ride. If Laurent had slept at all, he hadn't done so in the regent's bed. I'm over here like, yeah, Laurent's got some shit to do and his life is on the line in order to do it. Of course he's going to spend the entire evening studying if he needs to. I'd forgotten about that. Yeah, sure. There were fewer delays than Damon expected. Laurent's pre-dawn arrival and whatever cold, bitchy remarks he had made, sharpened by a night without sleep, had been enough to eject the Regent's men out of their beds and into a semblance of lines. They rode out. It's a scene break. There was no immediate disaster. They rode through long green meadows scented with white and yellow flowers, Govar crude and commanding on a war horse at their head, and beside him, young, elegant, and golden, the prince. Laurent looked like a figurehead, eye-catching and useless. Govar had not been disciplined at all for his stable boy-induced tardiness, nor had anything happened to the Regent's men for shirking their duty last night. There were in total 200 men, followed by servants and wagons and supplies and additional horses. There was no livestock, as there would be following a larger army on campaign. This was a small troop with the luxury of several supply stops on the way to their destination. There were no camp followers. But they stretched out for almost a quarter mile because of stragglers. Govar sent riders from the front streaming down to the end of the column to shout them into action, which caused a minor ruckus among the horses, but no noticeable improvement in forward motion. Laurent watched all of this, but did nothing about it. Setting up camp took several hours, which was too long. Time wasted was time robbed from rest when the prince's men had already been up half the preceding night. Govar gave basic commands, but did not care much for fine work or detail. Among the prince's men, George shouldered most of the responsibilities of captain, as he had done last night, and Damon took his orders from him. There were those among the Regent's men who simply worked hard because work needed to be done, but it was an impulse that came out of their own natures rather than through any external discipline or commands. There was little order among them, and no hierarchy, so that one man might shirk as he pleased with no repercussions except the growing resentment of the others around him. There was going to be a fortnight of this, with a fight at the end of it. Damon set his jaw, kept his head down, and got on with the work he had been assigned. He saw to his horse and his armor. He pitched the prince's tent. He moved supplies and hauled water and food. He washed with the men, ate. The food was good. Some things were done well. The sentries were posted promptly, and so were the outriders, taking up position with the same professionalism as the guards who had watched him in the palace. The site of the camp was well chosen. He was making his way through the camp to Pascal when he heard Orlan from the other side of a canvas. "You should tell me who did it so we can take care of it." "It doesn't matter who did it. It was my fault, I told you." Amaric's stubborn voice was unmistakable. Rocher saw 3 of the Regent's men coming out of the armory. He said one of them was Lazare. "It was my fault. I provoked the attack. Lazare was insulting the prince." Damon sighed, turned, and went to find George. "You might want to go see Orlan." "Why's that?" "Because I've seen you talk him down from a fight before." The man Jord had been speaking to gave Damon an unpleasant look after Jord left. "I heard you were good at carrying tales. And what will you be doing while Jord stops that fight?" "Getting massaged," said Damon, succinctly. He reported, ludicrously, to Pascal, and from thence to Laurent. The tent was very large. It was large enough for Damon, who was tall, to walk freely inside without having to glance nervously upwards to avoid obstructions. The canvas walls were covered in draperies of rich blue and cream, shot through with gold thread, and high above his head the ceiling hung suspended in scalloped folds of twilled silk. Laurent was seated in the entrance area, which was arranged for visitors with chairs and a receiving table, much like a Warfield tent. He was talking to one of the scruffier-looking servants about armaments. Except that he wasn't talking, he was mostly listening. He waved Damon inside to wait. The tent was warmed with braziers and further lit by candles. In the foreground, Laurent continued speaking to the servant. Screened away at the back of the tent was the sleeping area, a tumble of cushions, silks, and swathed bedding, and, emphatically separate, his own slave pallet. The servant was dismissed, and Laurent rose. Damon turned his eyes from the bedding to the prince, and found a silence stretching out in which Laurent's cool blue gaze was on him. Well, attend me, said Laurent. Attend, said Damon. The word sank into him. He felt as he had in the training arena when he had been unwilling to go near the cross. Have you forgotten how? Laurent said. He said, last time this did not end pleasantly. Then I suggest you behave better, said Laurent. Laurent turned his back on Damon calmly and waited. The lacing of Laurent's brocade outer garment began at his nape and ran in a single line all the way down his back. It was ridiculous to fear this. Damon stepped forward. In order to begin unlacing the garment, he had to lift his fingers and brush to one side the ends of the gilt hair, soft as fox fur. When he did so, Laurent tipped his head very slightly, offering better access. It was the normal duty of a body servant to dress and undress his master. Laurent accepted the service with the indifference of one long used to attendance. The opening in the brocade widened, revealing the white of an undershirt pressed warm against skin by the heavy outer fabric, and by armor atop that. Laurent's skin and the shirt were the exact same delicate shade of white. Damon pushed the garment over Laurent's shoulders and just for a moment felt, beneath his hands, the hard, corded tension of Laurent's back. That will do, said Laurent, stepping away and tossing the garment to one side himself. Go and sit at the table. On the table was the familiar map, weighted by 3 oranges and a cup. Arranging himself in the chair opposite Damon, casual in pants and undershirt, Laurent picked up one of the oranges and started peeling it. One corner of the map rolled up. When Vert fought Achilleus in Saint-Pélier, there was a maneuver that broke through our eastern flank. Tell me how that worked, Laurent said. Scene break. In the morning, the camp woke early, and Jord asked Damon to the impromptu practice field by the armory tent. It was, in theory, a good idea. Damon and the Varetian soldiers were proponents of different styles, and there were many things that they could learn from one another. Damon certainly liked the idea of returning to steady practice, and if Govar was not organizing drills, an informal gathering would substitute. When he arrived at the armory tent, he took a moment to survey the field. The prince's men were doing sword work, and his eye caught on Jord and Orlan, and then Aymeric. Not many of the regent's men were there with them, but 1 or 2 were, including Lazar. There had been no explosion last night, and Orlan and Lazar were within 100 paces of each other without any sign of bodily harm, but that meant that Orlan had a grievance that had not yet been expressed to his satisfaction, and as Orlan stopped what he was doing and came forward, Damon found himself face to face with a challenge that he should have predicted. He caught the wooden practice sword instinctively when Orlan tossed it to him. You any good? Yes, said Damon. He could see from the look in Orlan's eyes what he intended. People were beginning to take notice, pause in their own practice. This isn't a good idea, said Damon. That's right. You don't like fights, said Orlan. You prefer going behind people's backs. The sword was a practice weapon, wood from pommel to blade tip, with leather wound around the hilt to provide a grip. Damon felt the weight of it in his hand. Afraid to spar? Said Orlan. No, said Damon. Then what? Can't fight? Said Orlan. You're only here to fuck the prince? Damon swung. Orlan parried, and they were immediately caught up in the to and fro of a hard exchange. Wooden swords were unlikely to deal fatal blows, but they could bruise and break bone. Orlan fought with that in mind. His attacks held nothing back. Damon, having launched the first assault, now gave a step of ground. It was the kind of fighting that was done in battle, fast and hard, not in a duel, where the first few engagements were usually exploratory, cautious and testing, especially when the opponent was unknown. Here, sword clashed against sword, and the flurry of blows ceased only for a moment here and there, to be taken up quickly again. Orlan was good. He was among the best of the men on the field, a distinction he shared with Lazar, Jord, and 1 or 2 of the other prince's men, each of whom Damon recognized from his weeks of captivity. Damon supposed he should feel flattered that Laurent had set his best swordsman to guard him in the palace. It was over a month since Damon had last used a sword. It felt like longer since that day in Achilleus, when he had been naive enough to ask to see his brother. A month, but he was used to hours of hard daily training, a schedule begun in early childhood, into which a month's break meant nothing. It was not even long enough for sword calluses to soften. He had missed fighting. It satisfied something deep within him to ground himself in physicality, to focus on one art, on one person, move and counter-move at a speed at which thought became instinct. Yet the Varetian fighting style was different enough that responses could not be purely automatic, and Damon experienced a feeling that was partly release and partly simple enjoyment, with a great deal held, carefully, in check. A minute or two more, and Orlan disengaged and swore. "Are you going to fight me or not?" "You said we were sparring," said Damon, neutrally. Orlan flung down his sword, took 2 steps off to one of the watching men, and pulled from its sheath 30 inches of polished steel straight sword, which without preamble he swung with killing speed at Damon's neck. There was no time to think. There was no time to guess whether Orlan intended to pull the blow or whether he really meant to cleave Damon in half. The straight sword could not be parried. With Orlan's weight and momentum behind it, it would slice through a wooden practice sword as easily as it would through butter. Faster than the sword strike, Damon moved, inside Orlan's range and still moving, and in the next second Orlan's back hit the dirt, the wind knocked hard out of his chest, the tip of Damon's sword at his throat. Around them, the training area had gone quiet. Damon stepped back. Orlan, slowly, got to his feet. His sword lay on the ground. No one spoke. Orlan looked from his discarded sword to Damon and back again, but otherwise didn't move. Damon felt Jord's hand clasping his shoulder, and he removed his eyes from Orlan and looked in the direction that Jord indicated briefly with his chin. Laurent had come into the training area, and was standing not far off, by the arms tent, watching them. "He was looking for you," said Jord. Damon passed his own sword off and went to him. He walked over the tufted grass. Laurent made no attempt to meet him halfway, but simply waited. A breeze had sprung up. The flagging on the tent was flapping violently. "You were looking for me?" Laurent didn't answer, and Damon couldn't interpret his expression. "What is it?" said Damon. "You're better than I am." Damon couldn't help his amused breath of reaction to that, or the long, scrolling look from Laurent's head to his toes and back again, which was probably a little insulting, but really. Laurent flushed. The color hit his cheeks hard, and a muscle tightened in his jaw as whatever he felt was forcibly repressed. It was not like any reaction that Damon had ever seen from him before, and he couldn't resist pushing it a little further. "Why? Do you want to spar? We can keep it friendly," Damon said. "No," said Laurent. Whatever might have passed between them after that was forestalled by Jord, who was approaching from behind him with Aymeric. It's gonna be all right. It's gonna be all right. "Your Highness, apologies if you need more time with..." "No," said Laurent. "I'll speak with you instead. Follow me back to the main camp." The two walked off together, leaving Damon with Aymeric. "He hates you," said Aymeric, cheerfully. At the end of the day's ride, Jord came to find him. He liked Jord. He liked his pragmatism and the sense of responsibility he so clearly felt towards the men. Whatever background Jord had risen from, he had the makings of a fine leader. Even with all the additional duties Jord was shouldering, he had still taken the time to do this. "I want you to know," said Jord, "when I asked you to join us this morning, it wasn't to give Orlan the chance to..." "I know that," said Damon. Jord nodded slowly. "Anytime you want the practice, I'd be honored to go a few rounds against you. I'm a lot better than Orlan." "I know that too," said Damon. He got the closest thing to a smile he'd received from Jord. "You weren't that good when you fought Govar." "When I fought Govar," said Damon, "I had my lungs full of Shali." Another slow nod. "I'm not sure how it is in Akielos," said Jord, "but you shouldn't take that stuff before a fight. Slows your reflexes, saps your strength. Just some friendly advice." "Thank you," said Damon, after a long, drawn-out moment had passed. "Jamie, you can't be that funny." Whew, that's a scene break. When it happened, it was Lazar again, and Aymeric. It was the third night of the ride, and they were camped at, new French word, By... Bailo? Bailo? Bayo? No. Bailo? I'm gonna write that down. Bailo. It'll sound like Bailo while I read it. Unless we have quick guidance from M in here somewhere. Bayo. Bayo. Yes. I see what you mean. Bayo. And they were camped at Bayo Keep, a broken down structure with a fancy name. Lodgings inside were poor enough that the men eschewed the barracks, and even Laurent remained in his confection of a tent rather than spend the night indoors. But there were a few household servants in attendance, and the keep formed part of a supply line that allowed the men to restock. However the fight started, by the time anyone else heard it, Aymeric was on the ground with Lazare standing over him. He was dusty but unbloodied this time. It was bad luck that Gauvard was the one to intervene, which he did, dragging Aymeric up and then backhanding him across the face for making trouble. Gauvard was one of the first to arrive, but by the time Aymeric was rising to his feet, nursing his jaw, a respectable crowd was gathering, drawn by the noise. It was bad luck that it was late evening, and that most of the work for the day was gone, giving the men free time to gather. Jord had to physically hold Orlon back, and Gauvard didn't help by telling Jord to keep his men in line. Aymeric wasn't here to get special treatment, Gauvard said, and if anyone retaliated against Lazare, they'd get the post. Violence slid across the men like oil waiting for a flame, and if Lazare had made a single move of aggression, it would have ignited. But he took a step back, and had the good grace, or the smarts, to look troubled with Gauvard's pronouncement rather than pleased. Jord somehow managed to keep the peace, but when the men dispersed, he broke the chain of command completely and made straight for Laurent's tent. Damon waited until he saw Jord exit. Then he took a deep breath and sought entrance himself. When he walked into Laurent's tent, Laurent said, "You think I should have Lazare turned off? I've already heard it from Jord." Damon said, "Lazare's a decent swordsman, and he's one of the few of your uncle's men who buckles down to work. I think you should have Aymeric turned off." "What?" said Laurent. "He's too young. He's too attractive. He starts fights. He's not the reason I came to speak with you, but since you asked what I think, Aymeric causes problems, and one day soon he's going to stop making eyes at you and let one of the men fuck him, and the problems will get worse." Laurent absorbed that. "But I can't turn him off," said Laurent. "His father is Councillor Guillaume, the man you knew as the ambassador to Achielos." Oops. Forgot about that. Damon stared at him. He thought of Aymeric defending Laurent the armory, holding a bloody nose. He said evenly, "And which one of the border castles does his father hold?" "Fortaine," said Laurent in the same voice. "You're using a boy to gain influence with his father. Aymeric's not a child lured in with a honeyed treat. He's Guillaume's fourth son. He knows that his being here splits his father's loyalty. It's half the reason he joined me. He wants his father's attention," said Laurent. "If you're not here to talk to me about Aymeric, why are you here?" "You told me that if I had concerns or objections, you would hear arguments in private," said Damon. "I came here to speak with you about Gauvard." Laurent nodded slowly. Damon cast his mind back over the days of shoddy discipline. Tonight's fight had been the perfect opportunity for a captain to step in and begin to take control of the problems in the camp, with scrupulously equal punishments and the message that violence from either faction would not be tolerated. Instead, the situation had worsened. He was forthright. "I know that, for whatever reason, you are giving Gauvard free rein. Perhaps you'll hope he'll fall to his own mistakes, or that the more difficulties he causes, the easier it will be to dismiss him. But it isn't working like that. Now the men resent him, but by morning they will resent you for not mastering him. He needs to be brought swiftly under your command and disciplined for not following orders." "But he is following orders," said Laurent. And then, at Damon's reaction, "Not my orders." He had guessed that much at least, though he wondered what commands the regent would have given to Gauvard. "Do as you please and don't listen to my nephew." He thought probably something exactly like that. "I know you are capable of bringing Gauvard to heel without it being seen as an act of aggression against your uncle. I can't believe you fear Gauvard. If you did, you'd never have set me against him in the ring. If you're afraid of—" "That's enough," said Laurent. Damon set his jaw. The longer this goes on, the harder it will be to regain face with your uncle's men. They already talk about you like, I said that's enough, said Laurent. Damon was silent. It took a great deal of effort. Laurent was staring at him with a frown. Why do you give me good advice? Asked Laurent. Isn't that why you brought me with you? Instead of speaking those words aloud, Damon said, why don't you take any of it? I'm sorry, that's so funny. He was like, he wasn't going to say, isn't that why you brought me with you? So instead he says something equally as incendiary. Oh, I love him so much. Oh, I love him so much. Gavar is captain, and he has resolved matters to my satisfaction, said Laurent. But the frown hadn't left his face, and his eyes were opaque, as though his thoughts had turned inward. I have business to attend to outside. I won't require your services this evening. You have my leave to retire. Damon watched Laurent go, and only with half his mind experienced the urge to throw things. He knew by now that Laurent never acted precipitously, but always walked away and gave himself time and space alone to think. It was now time to step back and hope. That's the end of chapter 2. We'll be on page 37 for chapter 3 when we come back for the break. Damn, do I even have the book? Oh, I do. I have the bookmark with me. That was a moment of ADHD for you all. It's only been 37 pages, by the way. Only 37. And we have all of this. Like, we are immersed in this campaign to a certain trap. We already have... Already so much has happened. And yet, it does not feel rushed. At all. It feels very richly rendered. She's freakish, is what I mean. We are going to be back in just a few minutes to pick up on chapter 3. In the meantime, please enjoy the Gaywatch break room. Alrighty? I will be right back. Welcome back. We are here again for more Princess Gambit. we are can I speak? We are also we're on page like 37 and we were only reading for like an hour, so we could very well make it farther than I thought we would. So we might make it past chapter 3 is what I'm saying. We are on page 37, like I just said, for chapter 3, which I also just said. I talk for a living. Can you tell? Very professional am I. So, Damon didn't fall asleep right away, though he had more luxurious sleeping arrangements than any of the soldiers in the camp. His slave pallet was soft with pillows, and he had silk against his skin. He was awake when Laurent returned, and he pushed himself half up, unsure if he was needed. Laurent ignored him. Laurent, at night when their conversations were done, habitually paid him no more attention than a piece of furniture. Tonight Laurent sat at the table and wrote a dispatch by the light of the table candle. When he was finished, he folded and then sealed the dispatch with red wax, and a signet that he did not wear on his finger but kept in a fold of his clothes. He just sat for a while after that. On his face was the same inward-turned expression that he had worn earlier that night. Eventually, Laurent rose, snuffed the candle with his fingertips, and in the shadowed half-light from the braziers prepared himself for bed. The morning began well enough. Damon rose and attended to his duties. Fires were doused, tents were packed up and loaded onto wagons, and the men began readying themselves to ride. The dispatch that Laurent had written the night before galloped off to the east with a horse and a rider. The insults that were bandied about were good-natured, and no one was thrown into the dirt, which was about the best that could be hoped for from this group, Damon thought, as he prepared his saddlery. He became aware of Laurent on the periphery of his vision, pale-haired and wearing riding leathers. He was not the only one paying Laurent attention. More than one head was turned in Laurent's direction, and a few men had begun to gather. Laurent had Lazare and Aymeric before him. Feeling a flicker of unnamed anxiety, Damon put the saddlery he was working on down and made his way over. Aymeric, who showed everything on his face, was giving Laurent an open look of hero worship and mortification. It was clearly an agony to him that he was being brought to his prince's attention for an indiscretion. Lazare was harder to read. "Your Highness, I apologize. It was my fault. It won't happen again," was the first thing Damon heard when he came within earshot. Aymeric, of course. "What provoked you?" Laurent asked in a conversational tone of voice. It was only now that Aymeric appeared to realize that he was swimming in deep waters. "It isn't important, only that I was in the wrong." "It isn't important," said Laurent, who had to know, as his blue gaze came to rest mildly on Lazare. Lazare was silent. Resentment and anger lay underneath. Then they folded in on themselves, wedded to a sullen defeat as he dropped his gaze. Watching Laurent stare Lazare down, Damon was suddenly aware that Laurent was going to play this out, all of it, in public. Damon surreptitiously looked around himself. There were too many men watching already. He had to trust that Laurent knew what he was doing. "Where is the captain?" said Laurent. The captain could not immediately be found. Orlan was sent to search for him. Orlan was so long in searching for Gavar that Damon, recalling the stables, silently gave Orlan his sympathy, despite their differences. Laurent, calmly, waited. And waited. Things began to go awry. A silent communal snigger sprang up among the onlooking men and began to spread across the camp. The prince wished to have public words with the captain. The captain was forcing the prince to wait on his pleasure. Whoever was about to be taken down a notch, it was going to be amusing. It was amusing already. Damon felt the cold touch of awful premonition. This was not what he had meant for Laurent to do when he had given him advice last night. The longer Laurent was forced to wait, the more his authority was publicly eroded. When Gavar finally arrived, he approached Laurent leisurely, still fixing his sword belt in place, as though he had no qualms whatsoever in letting people know the carnal nature of what he had been doing. It was the moment for Laurent to assert his authority, and to discipline Gavar, calmly and without prejudice. Instead, Am I keeping you from fucking? Said Laurent. No, I finished. What do you want? Gauvard said, with an insulting lack of concern. And it was suddenly clear that there was something more between Laurent and Gauvard than Damon knew, and that Gauvard was unfazed by the prospect of a public scene, secure in the regent's authority. Before Laurent could reply, Orlan arrived. He had, by the arm, a woman with long brown curled hair and heavy skirts. This, then, was what Gauvard had been doing. There was a ripple of reaction from the watching men. You had me wait, said Laurent, while you bred your kit on one of the keep women. Men fuck, said Gauvard. It was wrong. It was all wrong. It was petty and personal, and a verbal dressing down wasn't going to work on Gauvard. He simply didn't care. Men fuck, said Laurent. I fucked her mouth, not her cunt. Your problem, said Gauvard. And it wasn't until that moment that Damon saw how wrong it was going, how secure Gauvard was in his authority, and how deeply rooted was his antipathy for Laurent. Is that the only man you've ever been hot for? Was your brother... And any hope Damon had that Laurent could control this scene ended, as Laurent's face shuddered, as his eyes went cold, and with the sharp sound of steel, his sword came out of its sheath. Draw, said Laurent. We'll get to that in a second. No. Damon took an instinctive step forward, then brought up short, his fists clenched impotently. He looked at Gauvard. He'd never seen Gauvard use a sword, but knew him from the ring as a veteran fighter. Laurent was a palace prince who had avoided border duty his whole life, and who never faced an opponent honestly if he could attack sideways. Worse, Gauvard had behind him the full backing of the regent, and though it was doubtful any of the men watching knew it, he had probably been given carte blanche to dispatch the nephew, if there arose any opportunity to do so. Gauvard drew. The unthinkable was going to happen. The captain of the guard, challenged to a duel of honor, was in front of the troop, going to cut down the heir to the throne. Laurent was apparently arrogant enough to do this without armor. He clearly didn't think he was going to lose, not if he was inviting the entire troop to watch it happen. He wasn't thinking clearly at all. Laurent, with his unmarked body and his pampered indoor skin, would be fresh from palace sports where his opponents would have always, politely, let him win. He's going to be killed, thought Damon, seeing the future in that moment with perfect clarity. Gauvard engaged with negligent ease. Steel grated along steel as the swords of the two men came together in a burst of violence, and Damon's heart jammed itself into his throat. He hadn't meant to set this in motion, for it to end this way, not like this. And then the two men came apart, and Damon's heartbeat was loud with the shock of his surprise. At the end of the first exchange, Laurent was still alive. At the end of the second, also. At the end of the third, he was, persistently and remarkably, still alive, and watching his opponent calmly, measuringly. This was intolerable for Gauvard. The longer Laurent went unscathed, the more the situation embarrassed him, for Gauvard was after all stronger and taller and older and a soldier. This time Gauvard didn't allow Laurent any respite when he attacked, but pressed forward in a savage onslaught of cut-thrust attacks, which Laurent turned back, the jar of impact on fine wrists minimized by exquisite technique that worked with the impetus of his opponent rather than against it. Damon stopped wincing and started watching. Laurent fought like he talked. The danger lay in the way he used his mind. There was not one thing he did that was not planned in advance, yet he was not predictable, because in this, as with everything he did, there were layers of intent, moments when expected patterns would suddenly dissolve into something else. Damon recognized the signs of Laurent's inventive deceptions. Gauvard didn't. Gauvard, finding himself unable to close as easily as he had expected, did the one thing that Damon could have warned him not to do. He got angry. That was a mistake. If there was one thing that Laurent knew, it was how to prick someone into fury and then set about exploiting the emotion. Laurent turned back Govar's second surge with an easy grace and a particularly Varetian series of parries that made Damon itch to pick up a sword. By now, anger and disbelief were really affecting Govar's swordsmanship. He was making elementary mistakes, wasting strength and attacking in the wrong lines. Laurent was physically not strong enough to weather one of Govar's full-strength blows straight on his sword. He had to avoid them or counter them in sophisticated ways, with those angled parries and shifting momentum. They would have been lethal if Gavar had landed any of them. He couldn't manage it. As Damon watched, Gavar swung furiously, wide. He was not going to win this fight with anger driving him to foolish mistakes. That was becoming obvious to every man watching. Something else was becoming painfully clear. Laurent, possessing the sort of proportions that handed him balance and coordination as gifts, had not, as his uncle claimed, wasted them. Of course, he would have had the finest masters and the best tutelage, but to have attained this level of skill, he would also have had to have trained long and hard and from a very young age. It was not an even match at all. It was a lesson in abject public humiliation. But the one teaching the lesson, the one effortlessly outclassing his opponent, was not Gavar. "Pick it up," said Laurent the first time Gavar lost his weapon. A long line of red was visible along Gavar's sword arm. He'd given up 6 steps of ground, and his chest was rising and falling. He picked up his sword slowly, keeping his eyes on Laurent. There were no more anger-driven blunders, no more wrong-footed attacks or wild swings. Necessity made Gavar take stock of Laurent and face him with his best sword work. This time, when they came together, Gavar fought seriously. It made no difference. Laurent fought with cool, relentless purpose, and there was an inevitability to what was happening. To the line of blood blossoming this time down Gavar's leg, to Gavar's sword lying once more in the grass. "Pick it up," said Laurent again. Damon remembered Auguste, the strength that had held the front for hour after hour, and against which wave after wave had broken. And here fought the younger brother. "Thought he was a milksop," said one of the regent's men. "Think he'll kill him?" another speculated. Damon knew the answer to that question. Laurent was not going to kill him. He was going to break him. Here, in front of everyone. Perhaps Gavar sensed Laurent's intention, because the third time he lost his sword, his mind snapped. Throwing aside the conventions of a duel was preferable to the humiliation of a drawn-out defeat. He abandoned his sword and simply charged. This way it was simple. If he carried the fight to the ground, he'd win. There was no time for anyone to intervene. But for someone of Laurent's reflexes, it was enough time to make a choice. Laurent lifted his blade and drove it through Gavar's body, not through his stomach or chest, but through his shoulder. A slice or a shallow cut was not going to be enough to stop Gavar, and so Laurent braced the hilt of his sword against his own shoulder and used the whole weight of his body to drive it in harder and stop Gavar's motion. It was a trick used in boar hunting when the spear wounded but did not kill. Brace the blunt end of the spear against the shoulder and keep the impaled boar at bay. Sometimes a boar broke free or snapped the wood of the spear, but Gavar was a man run through with a sword, and he went to his knees. It took a visible effort of muscle and sinew for Laurent to pull the sword out. "Strip him," said Laurent. "Confiscate his horse and his belongings. Turn him out of the keep. There is a village 2 miles to the west. If he wants to badly enough, he'll survive the journey." He said it calmly into the silence, addressing 2 of the regent's men, both of whom moved without hesitation to obey his orders. No one else moved. No one else. Feeling as though he was coming out of a kind of daze, Damon looked around himself at the gathered men. He looked first to the prince's men, instinctively expecting to see his own reaction to the fight mirrored on their faces, but instead they showed gratification coupled with a total lack of surprise. None of them had been concerned that Laurent might lose, he realized. The response among the regent's men was more varied. There were signs of both satisfaction and amusement. They had perhaps enjoyed the spectacle, admired the show of skill. There was a hint of something else, too, and Damon knew they were men who associated authority with strength. Perhaps they were thinking differently about their prince and his pretty face, now that he had displayed some of it. It It was Lazare who broke the stillness, tossing Laurent a cloth. Laurent caught it and wiped off his sword as a kitchen hand would wipe a carving knife. Then he sheathed it, abandoned the cloth, now bright red. Addressing the men in a voice that carried, Laurent said, 3 days of poor leadership have culminated in an insult to my family's honor. My uncle can't have known what lay in the heart of the captain he appointed. If he had, he would have put him in the stocks, not given him leadership over men. Tomorrow morning there will be change. Today we ride hard to make up wasted time. Noise broke out into the silence as the milling men began to speak. Laurent turned away to attend to other business, pausing by Jord and transferring to him the captaincy. He placed a hand on Jord's arm and murmured something too quiet to hear, after which Jord nodded and began giving orders. And it was done. Blood pumped from Gavar's shoulder, reddening his shirt, which was stripped from him. Laurent's unsparing commands were carried out. Lazare, who had thrown Laurent the cloth, didn't look as though he was going to be mouthing off about Laurent again. In fact, the new way he was looking at Laurent reminded Damon unmistakably of Torvald. Damon frowned. His own reaction had him feeling oddly off balance. It was just that it was unexpected. He had not known this about Laurent, that he was trained like this, capable like this. He wasn't sure why he felt as though something, fundamentally, had changed. The brown-haired woman picked up her heavy skirts, walked over to Gavar, and spat on the ground beside him. Damon's frown deepened. The advice of his father came back to him. Never to take your eyes off a wounded boar, that once you engaged an animal in the hunt, you must fight it to the finish, and that when a boar was wounded, that was when it was the most dangerous animal of all. That thought nagged at him. That's a scene break. Now it's Henry who can't be that funny. He wasn't sure why. There was a strange feeling in his pants. Whew. Oh. This reveal that Laurent is as deadly with a weapon as he is with his brain, which makes all the sense in the world because there's obviously more than one way to sword fight. It's so good. To say nothing of baiting Gavar into losing his fucking mind and just charging, giving him an excuse, taking Damon's suggestion and turning it into something strategically plausible that Laurent can get away with. And he just had to stay up one evening and mull it over a little bit. He just did at least 3 things in one fell swoop. He got rid of Gavar. He installed one of his own. He installed Jord as the new captain. And made it very clear to the men that he is not to be trifled with, but he's also exceedingly competent in this way. We love a man. While still being the guy who did everything he did in the first book. Multitudes Laurent has. Wayfarer makes a very good point. Thank you. Laurent sent 4 riders galloping to Arles with the news. 2 of the riders were members of his own guard. 1 was of the regent's men, and the last was an attendant from Bayeux. I don't think that was right, but we'll go with it. Bayeux Keep. All 4 had witnessed with their own eyes the events of the morning, that Gavar had insulted the royal family, that the prince, in his infinite goodness and fairness, had offered Gavar the honor of a duel, and that Gavar, having been fairly disarmed, had broken the rules of engagement and attacked the prince intending to do him harm, a vile act thick with treason. Gavar had been justly punished. In other words, the regent was to be informed that his captain had been well and truly turned off in a manner that could not be painted as a revolt against the regency, or as princely disobedience, or as lazy incompetence. Round 1, Laurent. Yes. They rode in the direction of Vare's eastern border with Vask, which was bounded by mountains. They would make camp in the foothills at a keep called Nessun, and after that they would turn and make their wiggly way south. The combined effects of the cathartic violence of the morning and George's pragmatic orders were already reverberating through the troop. There were no stragglers. They had to push hard to reach Nessun after the delays of the morning, but the men did so willingly, and when they reached the keep the sunset was only just beginning to drain from the sky. Reporting to Jord, Damon found himself caught in a conversation that he wasn't ready for. "I could tell from your face. You didn't know he could fight." "No," said Damon, "I didn't." "It's in his blood." The regent's men seemed just as surprised as I was. "He's private about it." Oh, plot twist. Huge, huge plot twist. Laurent, private? You don't say. Multitudes, as we said. You saw his personal training ring inside the palace. He'll go a few rounds with some of the prince's guard occasionally, with Orlan, with me, laid me out a few times. He's not as good as his brother was, but you only have to be half as good as Auguste to be 10 times better than everyone else. Woo! In his blood. That wasn't quite it. There were as many differences as similarities between the two brothers. Laurent's build less powerful, his style built around grace and intelligence, quicksilver where Auguste had been gold. Nessun turned out to be different to Bayeux. Bayeux. Oh, can I get a reminder if M is still here? In 2 ways. First, it was attached to a respectably sized township, which lay near one of the few traversable passes through the mountains and received trade in the summer from the Vaskian province of Vervassel. Second, it was well kept enough, just, for the men to spend the night in the barracks and Laurent to lodge in the keep. Bayeux. Thank you, M. Damon was sent through the low door into the bedchamber. Laurent was outside, still mounted, attending to some matter involving outriders. Damon was given the servant's task of lighting the candles in the fire, which he did with his mind elsewhere. On the long ride from Bayeux, there had been a lot of time for thought. At first he had simply turned the duel he had witnessed over in his mind. Now he thought about the first time he had seen the regent discipline Laurent, stripping him of his lands. It was a punishment that might have been meted out privately, but the regent had turned it into a public display. Embrace the slave, the regent had ordered at the end of it. A gratuity, a garnish, an act of superfluous humiliation. He thought about the ring, the place where the court gathered to watch private acts played out in public, humiliations and simulated rapes turned into spectacle while the court looked on. And then he thought about Laurent. The night of the banquet when Laurent had orchestrated the exchange of slaves had been a long public battle with his uncle, planned out meticulously beforehand, and executed with precision. Damon thought about Nicaise, seated beside him at the high table, and Erasmus, warned in advance. He has a mind for details, Riddell had said. Damon was finishing with the fire when Laurent came into the room, still in riding clothes. He looked relaxed and fair, as though weathering a duel, cutting down his captain, and following that up with a day-long ride had had no effect on him at all. By now Damon knew him too well to be taken in by it, by any of it. He said, "Did you pay that woman to fuck Gavar?" Oh, now Damon's catching on to shit that I haven't even caught up on yet, and I've read this before. Oh. Laurent paused in the act of stripping off his riding gloves, and then, deliberately, he continued. He worked the leather from each finger individually. His voice was steady. "I paid her to approach him. I didn't force his cock into her mouth," Laurent said. Damon thought about being asked to interrupt Gavar in the stables and the fact that there were no camp followers at all riding with this troop. Laurent said, "He had a choice." "No," said Damon. "You only made him think he did." Laurent turned the same cool look on him that he had turned on Gavar. Expostulation? You were right. It needed to happen now. I was waiting for a confrontation to arise naturally, but that was taking too long. Damon stared at him. Guessing at it was one thing, but hearing the words spoken aloud was something else. Right? I didn't mean, he cut himself off. Say it, said Laurent. You broke a man today. Doesn't that affect you at all? These are lives, not pieces in a chess game with your uncle. You're wrong. We are on my uncle's board, and these men are all his pieces. Then each time you move one of them, you can congratulate yourself on how much like him you are. Damon! Oh, shit. And Damon only knows like half of what he's saying. Fuck. It just came out. He was in part still reverberating with the blow of having had his guess confirmed. He certainly didn't expect the words to have the effect on Laurent that they did. They stopped Laurent in his tracks. Damon didn't think he'd ever seen Laurent caught completely without words before, and since he couldn't imagine the circumstance was going to last long, he hurried to press his advantage. If you bind your men to you with deception, how can you ever trust them? You have qualities they will come to admire. Why not let them grow to trust you naturally, and in that way, there isn't time, said Laurent. The words pushed themselves with sheer force out of whatever wordless state Laurent had been shocked into. There isn't time, Laurent said again. I have 2 weeks until we reach the border. Don't pretend that I can woo these men with hard work and a winning smile in that time. I am not the green colt my uncle pretends. I fought at Marlis and I fought at Saint-Pellier. I am not here for niceties. I don't intend to see the men I lead cut down because they will not obey orders or because they cannot hold a line. I intend to survive. I intend to beat my uncle, and I will fight with every weapon that I have. You mean that? I mean to win. Did you think I was here altruistically to throw myself on the sword? Damon made himself face the problem, stripping away the impossible, looking only at what, realistically, could be done. 2 weeks isn't long enough, said Damon. You will need closer to a month to get anywhere at all with men like these, and even then the worst of them will need to be weeded out. All right, said Laurent. Anything else? Yes, said Damon. Then speak your mind, said Laurent. Not that you have ever done anything else. Damon said, I will help you in whatever way I can. But there will be no time for anything but hard work, and you will have to do everything right. Laurent lifted his chin and replied with every bit of cool, galling arrogance he had ever shown. Watch me, he said. That's the end of the chapter. Holy shit! Woo! God, me, Jesus, this is so freaking good. Oh, it's just so good. Everything about it is so good. We do indeed have some more time. And I believe chapter 4 comes with, scene breaks kind of as per usual, as this tends to do it. So we will have plenty of, we'll have plenty of opportunities through chapter 4 to come to a more natural stopping point at a scene break. So we are on, did I say? I did not. I just ADD'd that right out of my head for 55. We're on page 55 for chapter 4. I legitimately don't remember if I said that or not. Ooh. Damn. Jeez, Damon. God. It is hilarious the degree to which I don't remember Damon being this mouthy. It's so funny how he can pale in comparison to Laurent of all people, but still be this. Whew. Laurent, Just turned 20, and possessing an elaborate mind with a gift for planning, detached it from the petty intrigues of the court, and set it loose on the broader canvas of this, his first command. Damon watched it happen. It began when, after their long night of tactical discussion, Laurent addressed the troop with a portrait of their shortcomings. He did it from horseback, in a clear voice that carried to the farthest of the gathered men. He had listened to everything Damon had said last night. He had listened to a great deal more than that. As he spoke, there emerged nuggets that he could only have obtained from the servants and armorers and soldiers to whom, over the last 3 days, he had also been listening. Laurent regurgitated the information in a manner that was as scintillant as it was scathing. When he was done, he threw the men a bone. Perhaps they had been hampered by poor captaincy. They would therefore stop here in Nesson for a fortnight to accustom themselves to their new captain. Laurent would personally lead them in a regime that would tax them, trim them, and turn them into something approximating a company that could fight, if they could keep up with him. But first, Laurent appended silkily, they would unpack and make camp here again, from kitchens to tents to horse enclosure, in under 2 hours. The men swallowed it. They would not have had Laurent not taken on their leader and beaten him point for point the day before. Even then, they might have balked had the order come from an indolent superior, but from the first day, Laurent had worked hard without comment or complaint. That, too, had been calculated to within a hair. And so, they got to work. They hauled out tents and hammered in posts and pegs and unsaddled all the horses. Jord gave crisp, pragmatic orders. The tent lines looked straight for the first time since they had ridden out. And then it was done. 2 hours. It was still too long, but it was better by far than the sprawling chaos of the last few evenings. Resaddle was the first order, and there followed a series of mounted drills that were designed to be easy on the horses and brutal on the men. Damon and Laurent had planned the drills out together last night, with some input from Jord, who had joined them in the gray hours of the morning. Truthfully, Damon had not expected Laurent to take part in the drills himself, but he did, setting the pace. Reining his horse alongside Damon's, Laurent said, "You have your 2 extra weeks. Let's see what you can do with them." In the afternoon, they switched to line work, lines that broke again and again and again, until finally they didn't, if only because everyone was too weary to do anything but mindlessly follow commands. The day's drills had pushed even Damon, and when they were done, he felt, for the first time in a long time, as though something had been accomplished. The men returned to camp boneless and exhausted, with no energy to complain that their leader was a blonde, blue-eyed fiend, curse him. Damon saw Aymeric sprawled by one of the campfires with his eyes closed, like a man collapsed after a foot race. The stubbornness of character that had had Aymeric picking fights with men twice his size had also had him keeping up with the drills, no matter the barriers of pain and fatigue that he had had to push through physically. At least he would not be able to cause trouble in this state. No one would be picking fights. They were too tired. As Damon watched, Aymeric opened his eyes and gave an empty-eyed stare at the fire. Despite the complications Aymeric presented to the troop, Damon felt a stirring of sympathy. Aymeric was only 19, and this was obviously his first campaign. He looked out of place and alone. Damon detoured. "It's your first time in a company?" he said. "I can keep up," said Aymeric. "I've seen that," said Damon. "I'm sure your captain has seen it. You did a good day's work." Aymeric didn't answer. "The pace will stay steady for the next few weeks, and we've a month till we reach the border. You don't have to exhaust yourself on the first day." He said it in a kindly enough tone, but Aymeric answered stiffly, "I can keep up." Damon sighed and rose, and was 2 steps on his way to Laurent's tent when Aymeric's voice called him back. "Wait," said Aymeric. "You really think Jord has seen it?" And then he flushed as though he had given something away. That's a scene break. Pushing open the tent flap, Damon was confronted by a cool blue gaze that, by contrast, gave away nothing at all. Jord was already inside, and Laurent gestured for Damon to join them. The post-mortem, Laurent said. The day's events were dissected. Damon was asked for and gave his honest opinion. The men were not beyond hope. They were not going to become a perfectly trained company in a month, but they could be taught some things. They could be taught how to hold a line and how to resist an ambush. They could be taught basic maneuvers. Damon outlined what he thought was realistic. Jord agreed and added a few suggestions. 2 months, said Jord frankly, would be a hell of a lot more useful than 1. Laurent said, unfortunately, my uncle has tasked us with duty on the border, and as much as I would prefer it otherwise, we do have to arrive eventually. Jord snorted. They discussed a few of the men and tweaked the drills. Jord had a knack for identifying the root of camp problems. He seemed to take it as a matter of course that Damon was part of the discussion. When they were done, Laurent dismissed Jord and sat in the brazier warmth of the tent, gazing leisurely at Damon. Damon said, I should check over the armor before I turn in, unless you need me for something. Bring it in, said Laurent. He did. He sat down on the seat and looked over the buckles and straps and systematically checked every part, a habit that had been ingrained in him since childhood. Laurent said, What do you think of Jord? I like him, said Damon. You should be pleased with him. He was the right choice for captain. There was an unhurried pause. Aside from the sounds Damon made when he picked up a vambrace, the tent was quiet. No, said Laurent. You were. What? Said Damon. He gave Laurent a startled look, and was even more surprised to find that Laurent was gazing back at him steadily. There isn't a man here who'd accept orders from an Akyelin. I know that. It's one of the 2 reasons I chose Jord. The men would have resisted you at first. You'd have to prove yourself. Even with the extra fortnight, there wasn't enough time to play all of that out. It frustrates me that I cannot put you to best use. Damon, who had never considered himself a contender for the captaincy, was a little chagrined at his own hubris to realize it was because he instinctively saw himself occupying Laurent's role, or none. The idea that he might be promoted up through the ranks like a common soldier had simply not occurred to him. That's the last thing I expected you to say, he admitted, a little wryly. Did you think I was too proud to see it? I can assure you the pride I have invested in beating my uncle far outweighs the feelings I hold on any other account. You just surprised me, said Damon. Sometimes I think I understand you, and at other times I can't make you out at all. Believe me, that sentiment is mutual. You said 2 reasons, said Damon. What was the other? The men think you bend me over inside the tent, said Laurent. He said it in the same calm way he said everything. Damon fumbled the vambrace. It would erode my authority, my carefully cultivated authority. Now I have really surprised you. Perhaps if you were not a foot taller or quite so broad across the shoulders. It's considerably less than a foot, said Damon. Is it? Said Laurent. It feels like more when you argue with me on points of honor. I want you to know, said Damon carefully, that I haven't done anything to encourage the idea that you and I... If I thought you had, I'd have you tied to a post and flogged until your front matched your back. There was a long silence. Outside, there was the quiet of the bone-tired, sleeping camp, so that only the tent flaps and a few indeterminate sounds of shifting could be heard. Damon's fingers were hard on the metal of the vambrace until he deliberately loosened his grip. Laurent rose from his chair. The fingers of one hand lingered on the chair back. Leave that. Attend me, Laurent said. Damon rose. This was an uncomfortable duty, and he was annoyed. The garment Laurent wore today had ties in front rather than in back. Damon unlaced it gracelessly. It opened under his hands. He moved behind Laurent to draw it off. Shall I do the rest? He opened his mouth to say, after he put the garment away, feeling some urge to push the point, since this was as far as his service was generally required, and Laurent could just as easily have taken his outer garments off himself. Except that when he turned back, Laurent had lifted his hand to his shoulder and was rolling it, obviously feeling slight stiffness. His lashes had dipped. Under the shirt, his limbs were unknitted with languor. He was, Damon realized, exhausted. Damon felt no sympathy. Instead, unreasoningly, his annoyance peaked, Laurent pushing slow fingers into his golden hair in an enervated gesture, somehow a reminder that his captivity and his punishment were all the doing of a single flesh-and-blood man. He held his tongue. 2 weeks here and 2 weeks' travel to the border, see Laurent safely escorted, and he was done. That's a scene break. Henry, you gotta stop being funny. Jesus. Whew. I can't. We'd be here all day. But, suffice to say that obviously that I'm fond of this trilogy. And it's just wild that I get to, word by word, be reminded why. I really need to make it a habit to just reread this once a year. If not, potentially twice a year. I really should. In the morning, they did it all again. And again. Getting the men to follow orders designed to push them was an achievement. Some of these men enjoyed hard work, or were of the type who understood that they had to be pushed in order to be improved, but not all of them. Laurent accomplished it. That day, the troop was worked, molded, and shaped towards its purpose, sometimes, it seemed, by will alone. Laurent had no camaraderie with the men. There was none of the warm, heart's love that the Achelan armies had held for Damon's father. Laurent wasn't loved. Laurent wasn't liked. Even among his own men, who would follow him off a cliff, there was the unequivocal consensus that Laurent was, as Orlan had once described him, a cast-iron bitch, that it was a very bad idea to get on his bad side, and that as for his good side, he didn't have one. It didn't matter. Laurent gave orders, and they were followed. Men found, when they tried to balk, that they couldn't. Damon, who had been maneuvered variously into kissing Laurent's foot and eating sweetmeats from his hands, understood the machinery that confronted and compelled them, deep buried in each individual circumstance. And, perhaps out of this, a thin thread of respect was growing. It was apparent why his uncle had kept Laurent away from the reins of power. He was good at leading. He fixed his eyes on his goals and was prepared to do whatever he had to in order to achieve them. Challenges were faced clear-eyed. Problems were seen in advance, unraveled, or sidestepped. And there was something in him that was enjoying the process of bringing these hard men under his control. Damon was aware that what he was witnessing was nascent kingship, the first flexings of command of a prince born to rule, though Laurent's brand of leadership, equal parts consummate and disturbing, was nothing like his own. Inevitably, some of the men did resist orders. There was an incident that first afternoon when one of the regent's mercenaries refused to follow George's commands. Around him, one or two of the others were sympathetic to his grievance, and when Laurent appeared, there were rumblings of genuine unrest. The mercenary had enough of the sympathy of his fellows that there was the danger of a minor insurrection if Laurent ordered him put on the post. A crowd gathered. Laurent didn't order him put on the post. Laurent flayed him verbally. It was not like his exchanges with Gauvard. It was cool, explicit, appalling, and it reduced a grown man in front of the troop as utterly as his sword thrust had done. The men got back to work after that. Damon heard one of them say, in a tone of odd admiration, "That boy has got the filthiest mouth I've ever heard." They returned to camp that evening to find that there was no camp, because the servants at Nessen had dismantled everything, on Laurent's orders. He was being generous, he said. They had an hour and a half to make camp this time. For whatever reason, "that boy has got the filthiest mouth I've ever heard" is one of the very specific lines of dialogue that I always remember, that I think of fondly whenever I think of Captive Prince. I just love it so much. His own soldiers just being in awe of the sheer and utter nastiness and filth that comes from such a beautiful package. Royal package, no less. That was a scene break. Did I say that? They trained for the better part of the 2 weeks, camped in the fields of Nessen. The troop would never be a precision instrument, but they were becoming a blunt but usable tool, able to ride together and fight together and hold a line together. They followed straightforward commands. They had the luxury of being able to wear themselves out, and Laurent was taking full advantage of it. They were not going to be ambushed here. Nesson was safe. It was too far from the Ekielan border to throw suspicion for an attack southward, and it was close enough to the border with Vask that any attack could lead to a political quagmire. If Akielos was the region's goal, there was no reason to wake the sleeping Vaskian Empire. Besides which, Laurent had brought them so far from the route the region had originally planned for him to take that any traps left in wait for them would be left languishing, waiting for a company that never arrived. Damon began to wonder if the sense of steady building and accomplishment that was growing in the troop was infecting him too, because by the 10th day, when the men were drilling like they could face an ambush with at least a chance of survival, he had begun to feel the first fragile stirrings of hope. That evening, in a rare moment without duties, he was beckoned over to one of the campfires by Jord, who sat there alone, stealing a moment's peace. He offered Damon wine in a dented tin cup. Damon accepted it and sat down on the bowed log that was an impromptu resting place. They were tired enough that they were both content to sit in silence. The wine was awful. He swirled it around in his mouth, then swallowed it. The warmth from the fire was good. After a while, Damon became aware that Jord's gaze was occupied with something on the far edges of the camp. Aymeric was tending to his armor outside one of the tents, which showed that somewhere along the line he had picked up good habits. That probably wasn't why Jord was looking at him. "Aymeric," said Damon, raising his eyebrows. "What? You've seen him," said Jord, lips quirking. "I've seen him. Last week he had half the camp at each other's throats." "He's all right," said Jord. "It's only that he's high-born and not used to rough company. He's doing the right thing by what he knows. It's just that the rules are different, like how it is with you." That was chastening. Damon took another mouthful of the awful wine. "You're a good captain. He could do a lot worse." "There are some low-lifes in this company, and that is the truth," said Jord. "I think another few days like today, and the worst of them will be shaken loose." "Another few minutes like today," said Jord. Damon let out a breath of amusement. The fire was hypnotic, unless you had something better to look at. Jord's eyes returned to Aymeric. "You know," said Damon, "he's going to let someone eventually. Better all round if it's you." There was a long silence, and then, in an oddly diffident voice, "I've never betted anyone highborn," said Jord. "Is it different?" Damon flushed when he realized what Jord was assuming. We don't. He doesn't. As far as I know, he doesn't with anyone." "As far as anyone knows," said Jord. "If he didn't have a mouth on him like a harlot in a guard's room, I'd think he was a virgin." Damon was silent. Dramatic irony. He drained his mug, frowning a little. He wasn't interested in these endless speculations. He didn't care who Laurent took to bed. He was rescued from replying by Aymeric. His unlikely savior had brought 1 or 2 armor pieces with him and was making to sit on the opposite side of the fire. He had stripped down to his undershirt, which was partially unlaced. "I'm not intruding, am I? The fire has better light." "Why don't you join us?" said Damon, putting his mug down and carefully not looking at Jord. Aymeric had no love for Damon, but Jord and Damon were the highest-ranked members of the company, in their different ways, and an invitation was difficult to refuse. He nodded. "I hope I'm not speaking out of turn," said Aymeric, who had either now been punched in the nose enough times to learn circumspection, or was just naturally more deferential around Jord. "But I grew up at Fortaine. I lived there most of my life. I know that since the war at Marlis, border duty is a formality, but the prince has his training for real action." "He just likes to be prepared," said Jord. "If he has to fight, he wants to be able to rely on his men." "I prefer that," said Aymeric quickly. "I mean that I prefer to be part of a company that can fight. I'm a 4th son. I admire hard work just as I admire men who can rise above their birth." He said that last with a look at Jord. Damon wisely made his excuses and rose, leaving them alone together. And that is where we have to leave for today. Holy shit, we are on page 68 in a single session. So I'm going to have to recalculate how long it's going to take us. to finish this trilogy if it's going to be like this. But also, we're only on page 68. I know I said it before, but this woman's efficiency with language is truly unhinged. I also want to know, because I know this was an online story, because this was back in 2016. Nowadays, books like these can actually get published. But back in 2016, it is not unsurprising to learn that this was a story that C.S. Picard posted online that then got so popular and gained so much traction that she then was traditionally published. But I'd still love to know, like, the editing process, because since it was originally posted online, did she edit this herself, or was there an editing phase? Back in 2016, I imagine that there would be an editing phase from online to here. But of course, I was not on Captive Prince from the word go. I never read the online version. I've only read the books that we have. Oh, did she only post online the first book? That would make sense that it would get picked up sooner than the whole trilogy finishing, actually. The first two. Gotcha. Thank you, Em. So yeah, the first two books. I wonder. I just kind of want to know anything. Actually, if anybody knows of any text or audio or video interviews with C.S. Picard about Captive Prince, please, for the love of God, link me in a comment on this stream. Or anywhere, really. Because I haven't been able to find much on my own, but then again, I haven't looked in a while. So I'm not sure if she's talked very much about Captive Prince at all. But if she has, I will listen to literally anything she has to say about this trilogy. Kind of about writing in general, but this trilogy specifically. Whew. There's so much. So much? Oh, really? There's so many interviews. How have I not found anything? Listen, sometimes my internet searching capabilities are really pathetic, and I don't know why. I don't do anything differently, but man, sometimes I just really come up on empty. She's even broken down specific chapters. Oh my God. This is an early birthday present for me. Holy shit. Give me all the links. Give me all of them. Please. I'm begging. Oh my God. I would die. Holy shit. Please do. Please, 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 please. Oh, what a lovely note to end on. So that is it for Princess Gambit. We pick this up next Tuesday because I read gay things on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I am having the most fun. You could not possibly have more fun than I am having right now. It's also kind of painful because I know everything. So much like I think people were talking about in the chat earlier, I'm noticing things on this reread that I can't talk about or react to in front of y'all. So I'm having to suppress myself at various points. We'll be okay. We'll be all right. I will see you guys on Tuesday. Thank you so much for tuning in. Leave it a like. Tell a friend that, you know, some ridiculous fangirl is reading Captive Prince. And I will see you guys next week for more of Princess Gambit, okay? Alrighty. You guys have a lovely weekend. And I will see you then. Please take care of yourselves.